Good afternoon, everyone. Now that the live stream is up and running, we can actually do what we're doing here. My name is Ryan Danker, and I have the privilege to serve as the director of the John Wesley Institute. I love the fact that this good man is right here. If you need to know more about John Wesley, see me afterwards. Welcome to Anglicanism in the Public Square. This conference has been a major undertaking of the Institute, and I'm thrilled that you're all here. We have a stellar lineup of speakers, most of whom are in the room right now. And they represent the depth and the breadth of the broad Anglican tradition. Before we get going, I have to thank two people in particular, although there are many thanks to give out. And the first person I want to thank isn't in the room yet because he's finishing another conference, and that is Mark Tooley, who is the president of the Institute on Religion and Democracy. His support has been vital to this endeavor, and we'll see him later today. But I also want to thank the Reverend Tim Cole, who is standing in the back here. He is the rector of this great church, Christ Church, Georgetown. Special thanks to Tim and to the entire staff of Christ Church. Tom Smith is also there. He is the choir director. You'll hear Tom and the choir later tonight. We have been wonderfully blessed by Christ Church, and I'm sure you'll experience the hospitality of this parish over the next 2 days. In a pamphlet that was published in the late 1930s, it had the wonderful, catchy title, "What Has the Episcopal Church Done for America?" Nelson R. Burr argued that the moral vision of Anglicanism, its commitment to education and its concern for the welfare of all people, were all hallmarks of an Episcopalian public theology. Now, you can tell in the text that he wrote, and I won't read the entire thing to you, you can read it online. You can tell that, one, he was a Southerner, and two, he was an Anglo-Catholic. He refers to the Civil War as the war between the states, and he's keen to point out the great contributions of Virginia and South Carolina while begrudgingly acknowledging there might have been help from Pennsylvania and New York. In a striking claim, he actually argues that the creation of vestries in Episcopalian parishes in the colonial period can be seen as a precursor to the republicanism that emerges with the Revolution. Now, whether those happy Tories would agree with him is another question. He also argues that both the emphasis on a transformed life and the reemergence of monasticism within Anglo-Catholic circles had great social impact. Transformed lives equal transformed societies. Finally, he closes with a call for churchmen to have a social conscience, something that he believes stems directly from the Anglican tradition. The call to be a voice of conscience to the nation is something that is paramount for Burr, and in fact, if you want to see more of that, look at the monuments at the National Cathedral, particularly in the mid-20th century. What Burr did in his pamphlet, however, is exactly what we're doing here today and tomorrow, to explore the social repercussions of what it means to follow Jesus in the Anglican tradition. And I'm excited to hear what our speakers all have to say about that vital topic. Before we get going, though, because this is a Christian gathering, I've actually invited the rector, Tim Cole, to come up and lead us in prayer. So in good Anglican fashion, will you please stand?
Let us pray. Heavenly Father, we give thanks for this opportunity to gather together to reflect and ponder the Church's engagement with the world. We pray for the Church across the world today as it faces many different contexts and many different challenges. And we pray for the Church here in America as we face our own context and our own set of challenges. We ask your blessing upon all who will speak and address us in these days, and we ask your blessing upon each one of us. All this we ask through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you.
So we will launch right into session one, and I'd like to invite Ambassador Pham and Dr. Inman to come and join me up here. For those of you who, the schedule is available in tactile form and online, so if you want to see that. And we're going to be joined via Zoom. John Milbank is joining us from Nottingham, and apparently he's going to be looming above us shortly. First up is the Reverend Dr. Daniel Inman, who is the Chancellor and Canon at Chichester Cathedral and visiting fellow of the University of Chichester. He is the editor of the International Journal for the Study of the Christian Church and author of The Making of Modern English Theology. He is a three-time graduate of Oxford University. He's presenting today Anglicans and Empire, Negotiating the Past in the Public Square. So, Dan, welcome.
Thank you very much, Ryan, and to the Institute for this invitation to be part of this conference. I want us to cast our minds back to late June 1897. London was the stage for one of the largest set pieces of Imperial Britain. 3 million visitors descending upon the capital for Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee, which featured as its centrepiece a vast procession from Buckingham Palace to St Paul's Cathedral, where the elderly and frail Queen sat in her carriage at the cathedral step before a vast panoply of clergy, dignitaries from across the empire, and mass choirs who led a 20-minute ceremony of noble simplicity, a Te Deum, a blessing, and the singing of the Old Hundredth. Not unlike the state funeral of Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II last month, the elaborate and musically awesome ceremonial conveyed the deep integration of the established church, the armed forces from across the empire, the Crown and Her Majesty's governments across the world, with 11 colonial prime ministers in attendance. As David Cannadine has observed, the diminishment of the Crown's actual power during and after Victoria's reign was accompanied by the Crown's ritualistic aggrandizement. Even though the political power of the Queen Empress over her vast territories was in fact minimal, the drama of the Crown was a potent vector of the idea of a Greater Britain and her colonies. The Church of England was a vital pillar in this idea, such as it played out in ritual both at home and in its far-flung outposts. The ranks of bishops who stood above Victoria, many drawn from across the empire and in London for the Lambeth Conference, positioned Anglicanism as the means of benediction upon Britain's empire, both of the Queen Empress herself, who was of course defender of the faith, but also a visible blessing of that lingering conception of the empire as a means of providence, a means of spreading the gospel globally alongside civilization and commerce. In fact, actual adherence to the so-called Anglican communion across the empire was not unlike the power of the Crown itself, actually far more limited than the ceremony suggested. Since the Whig administrations of the 1830s, there had been little enthusiasm in Westminster to fund new church establishments. And even where they still existed in some form, such privileges as the church possessed were either being dismantled during that decade in response to agitation from large Scottish Presbyterian and Roman Catholic settler populations, such as in British North America or Australia, or as in India, the church establishment was largely irrelevant beyond its service to the relatively small settler community. Nonetheless, the Church of England had undoubtedly been seduced at points by the idea of an imperial Anglicanism. From its origins in the Caribbean and the American colonies, the King's Church, as it had been then known, was the purveyor of civic religion in settler colonies. It performed the prayer book observances of the sovereign's accession, annual thanksgivings for deliverance from Catholic tyranny, sustaining the Protestant ideal abroad, the sovereign's birthday, and later it was the locus for colonial commemorations of jubilees, funerals, and coronations. We might note that even with the death of Queen Elizabeth II, the prevalence of memorial services in Anglican churches and cathedrals worldwide, even here in Washington, in the Episcopal National Cathedral, has been testimony to the strength of an abiding ritual familiarity between the British Crown and Anglicanism, which has strangely endured well beyond the sun setting on the British Empire. Indubitably, this also empowered and gave a sense of superiority to the Church of England at home. In the 19th and 20th century, in an age in which the C of E was fast losing its religious monopoly in the British public square, its proximity to the Crown and to the rituals of an ever-expanding empire almost certainly made it harder for those who argued for disestablishment. Likewise, as G.A. Bremner has demonstrated in his beautiful book, Imperial Gothic, as the Church of England rapidly established dioceses across the Second Empire from 1841 onwards, funded by the Colonial Bishoprics Fund, we can recognise a remarkable coherence of ethos between church and state. Funding flowed into the church's missionary work, both at home and abroad, to facilitate a coherent imperial architecture. Cathedrals and churches designed by Butterfield, Burgess and Gilbert Scott inter alia, with stained glass and furnishings from Burne-Jones and Pugin. All these sat alongside impressive neo-Gothic universities and schools in Bombay, Sydney or Hong Kong. Here was expressed, for all to see for generations to come, an easy fluidity between the pew, library, gentleman's club and governor's residence. From Bermuda in the 17th century to Sydney or Lagos in the 1930s, the Church of England seems physically, at least, entwined in the projects of empire. In recent years, that relationship of Anglicanism to the British imperial vision has come to be interrogated more closely beyond the spread of the prayer book, missionary expansion, and the abolitionist cause among evangelicals or the Tractarian enthusiasm for the neo-Gothic. In particular, the Church of England's involvement in slavery has come into sharper focus among historians, keen to deconstruct a lopsided emphasis on the Anglican abolitionists. Historiographically, this is important. The 19th century empire saw itself as a broadly humanitarian venture, its moral vision informed by its concerted and often costly efforts to stop the trade in enslaved Africans from 1807 onwards. But Black Lives Matter and challenges to racist attitudes within the contemporary Church of England have more recently encouraged renewed attention upon the close proximity of the C of E through its primary missionary society of the 18th century, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, SPG, in the horror of slavery in the Caribbean and American plantations in the 17th and 18th centuries. Indeed, we might easily forget that the broad opposition of bishops to abolitionist legislation at the turn of the century owed much to the SPG's possession of enslaved Africans on Barbados on the Codrington estate, where they were infamously branded with society across their chests, as well as the bishop's personal investments in plantations. Henry Philpotts, the Bishop of Exeter, for example, would receive a handsome payout as a joint owner of 665 enslaved Africans on Jamaica. Infamously, too, church bells were rung in Bristol when Wilberforce's anti-slavery bills were defeated in Parliament. There were also undoubtedly nefarious side effects of noble objectives. Wilberforce's efforts to open India to missionaries in the years that followed abolition necessitated, within Parliament and beyond, a rhetoric that portrayed the Hindu as a primitive heathen admired in pagan ritual, echoed by liberal reformers keen to open up India to new commerce. While their instincts were to rid Indian society of infanticide or the horror of sati, the self-immolation of Hindu widows upon their husbands' pyres, by their political agitation, missionaries arguably played a significant role in othering indigenous populations, that is, the conscious and unconscious dehumanization and exclusion of other races or religions that certainly contributed towards a well-recorded racism in India by the mid-19th century, a racism which undoubtedly associated whiteness with Christian civilization and which was intensified following the rebellion in 1857. This was an association that had been learnt in the brutal need to control the enslaved in the Caribbean, where, as Catherine Gerbner has highlighted, there had in the mid-17th century been a subtle but significant change in the legal terminology for defining enslaved Africans. Within a generation, the controlled were redefined as Negroes, having hitherto been defined as heathen, an unfortunate outcome of missionaries seeking to convert the enslaved peoples and thus requiring from the plantation class that legislated a new terminology of oppression. Racist categorizations would be replicated and adopted in dehumanizing forms across empire, from indigenous Australians in the 1780s to the more recent attempts of Canadian nationalists to eradicate First Nations culture in Anglican and Roman Catholic residential schools in the mid-20th century. From Jean and John Comaroff in their 1991 of Revelation and Revolution to more recent campaigners seeking to decolonize Anglicanism, the Church's relationship to empire has been presented as hand in glove. I want to posit several reasons, drawn very broadly from my preparations for a new book on the Church of England's relations to Britain's empire, to express caution about the wholesale denunciation of the Church of England's engagement with empire, however. The first is surely the complex question of making moral judgments within the historical task. Take, for example, the case of Christopher Codrington, a leading Barbadian plantation owner and colonial governor who, upon his death in 1713, divided his estates between All Souls, Oxford, where he had been a fellow, and to the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, who were instructed to use his estate on Barbados to establish a college on a quasi-Oxonian model for the teaching of divinity and surgery. Frankly, it's not impossible to imagine that Codrington would have recognised contemporary anxiety about his links to the enslavement of peoples. After all, he sought to establish a college in Barbados to improve what he felt to be the barbaric treatment of enslaved peoples, and hoped the Church of England could model a Christian plantation to the island of Barbados. Such an idea is, of course, deeply objectionable to us who rightly find the idea of Christian slavery abhorrent. But herein lies a thorny question of how to make an ethical judgment. We probably wouldn't join Herbert Butterfield in claiming that making moral judgments in history to be the most useless and unproductive of all forms of reflection. However, the process of judging Codrington's motivations as a historian might, to the present, offer a range of moral responses depending on the approach. Might we agree with E.H. Carr that Codrington himself can't be judged, but the institution of the SPG might, as a society that owned more enslaved Africans than missionaries in the 18th century? How do we take into account that both Codrington and the SPG operated in a world in which slavery was a fact of European and global civilizations, for Muslims, Christians, and of course those West African peoples that enslaved their own before selling them onto European trading companies? As Linda Colley teased out in her book Captives, those who shelled out money for the SPG in parishes across England would also have been regularly asked, especially in the southwest of England, to raise money to pay ransoms for Englishmen who'd been kidnapped and enslaved by Barbary pirates. The Church's engagement with empire here is one that requires historical sensitivity. Codrington's intention for Barbados was such that the college that bears his name today in Barbados, a theological college for ordinands of the Church of the West Indies, has not sought to eradicate his name and indeed offers scholarships in his name to its students, invariably all of Afro-Caribbean heritage. Within his own context, he is judged by Barbadians themselves to have been acting as a humanitarian in an age with altogether different standards. In Oxford, however, a confidence in a supra-historical morality, whilst Oxford tends to be entirely relativist in many other respects, has led to Codrington's name being erased from the library, his money established. Two markedly different moral responses, then, to the activities of a leading lay Anglican in the early 18th century. And similar questions, of course, might be addressed to many of the slave-owning founding fathers of the United States, who were members of the King's Church. And here it is important to recognise that Anglican missionaries and mission societies were institutionally distinct from the imperial state, and often proudly so. Very often they were a major irritant to it, whether through their self-governing structures that had as their goal making the European missionary presence extinct through establishing indigenous control of the churches, and invariably as Protestants through the education of local populations in reading and writing that many a colonial administrator disapproved of, or the risky extension of missionaries into territories beyond British military control, often causing grief for the colonial office, or especially later in the century, the increasingly influential roles for women in missionary endeavour that not only clashed with metropolitan expectations of women in public life, but also arguably empowered women in colonised societies. Moreover, while we may not go as far as Gordon Leff in asserting that it is impermissible to judge the historical actor by canons which do not apply, or to attribute to them responsibility for that which belongs to subsequent events, the historian charting the Church of England's relationship to Britain's empire will naturally want to pay closer attention to the stated motivations of Anglican institutions and missionaries themselves. For all the Marxist denunciation of the Church of England as a handmaiden of a rapacious empire, it must be underlined that it was rarely capitalist economics that animated thousands of men and women out into the fringes of empire with all its attendant risks, but a set of metaphysical beliefs about salvation. Theology mattered to these people, and particularly with a growing emphasis in English theology on the incarnation in the later 19th century, missionaries were arguably ahead of the anthropologists in seeking to tease out the truth in the belief structures of other religions as part of their evangelistic discernment. Lux Mundi was arguably a compelling catalyst for indigenous cultures being taken more seriously than colonial administrators generally liked. And this relates to my final assertion, that Anglican missionaries, particularly in the 20th century, became important vehicles in the undoing of empire. Think of those influenced by Christian socialism in particular, who interrogated the capitalist paternalism at the turn of the 20th century. Perhaps most famously, the Reverend Charles Freer Andrews, who had argued that the Bible was a truly Eastern book written by Easterners, arguing it ought to be read carefully alongside other books of the East, and who was a friend and key supporter of Gandhi, for instance. Similarly, a series of Anglo-Catholic bishops in southern Africa were defenders of the rights of Africans in the face of increasingly assertive white supremacist communities and much racist colonial legislation, however ineffective they were in actually opposing it. Yet the mission societies and religious communities in the southern province would prove to be important cradles for nationalist movements in the 20th century, particularly through education. Think, for example, of Trevor Huddleston and his critique of the Southern African governments in the 1940s and 50s. Certainly, danger lies in generalisations about Anglicanism and colonialism, not least when talking about a theologically and ecclesiologically complex institution like the Church of England, which I'm always reminding people doesn't really exist. It's just a series of dioceses, so sort of congealed in the centre, increasingly congealed and stuck. Anyway, but we can't make generalisations about it over 4 centuries, as much as we can't make generalisations about the shifting form and motivations of Britain's empire over the same period. However, if we are to grasp a clearer understanding of the often destructive dynamics of our current culture wars in the public square around race, church and empire, both within Anglicanism and beyond it, both historians and commentators are in need of a richer and more sensitive appreciation of the often antagonistic and twisting story of the Church of England and Britain's imperial and post-imperial story. Thank you.
Well, we'll take some time. If you're in the back and you want to, the seats up front are fantastic. It's like the mourner's bench at a revival meeting, right? All right. I forgot to tell you exactly how we're organizing this. We're going to have the speakers speak 3 in a row. We'll have them converse for a little bit, and then we'll open up to the floor. That's how each session will be run. Our next speaker is Ambassador J. Peter Pham. He is Distinguished Fellow at the Atlantic Council here in Washington, D.C. He has extensive experience in global diplomacy and is former United States Special Envoy to the Great Lakes and Sahel regions of Africa. He is the author of numerous books, most recently, A Measured U.S. Strategy for the New Africa with James L. Jones. His doctoral degree is from the Pontifical Gregorian in Rome, and on top of all of that, he is an Episcopal priest. I'd like to welcome Ambassador Pham.
Thank you very much, Ryan, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with you. One should never judge a book by its cover, so no conclusion should be drawn about my churchmanship by the fact I'm in Mufti today. As the third largest group of Christians in the world and a global presence of 42 provinces, ranging from, of course, the province of Canterbury, whose origins hearken to the arrival at the court of King Ethelbert of Kent in the year of our Lord 597 of St. Augustine, sent by Pope St. Gregory the Great, to the Anglican Church of Mozambique and Angola, inaugurated just 13 months ago via an online celebration, thankfully not from the Welby's kitchen table. And one would expect from all this that Anglicanism's contribution to international affairs will be greater than it actually is. And it's something that has troubled me and at the same time fascinated me, both as an academic and obviously as introduced also as a member of this church and also as a diplomat. But first, if you'll permit me, a little bit of personal context for why this tension has been something of a fascination for me. My personal background is both a theologian, an academic theologian, but also as a political scientist. As both an academic and as a practitioner of both, and as a priest and as a diplomat, I find myself living this tension very much on a almost day-to-day basis, and I continue to do so. And what I like in my paper, I drew some conclusions, which I'd like to run through, both from history of the formative period, I would argue, of modern Anglicanism and international affairs, and then some more recent characteristics that I've noted, and then finally conclude with some modest recommendations on how the third largest body in Christendom might actually punch at least at its weight, if not above it. Some conclusions from history, and this is the formative period, and I take as my starting point the beginning of the Lambeth conferences, going back, the middle of the 19th century that Dr. Edmund mentioned earlier. And first point I would make as far as conclusions is, first, there is a hermeneutic of suspicion about centralization. Understandable, given our polity and ecclesiology, but at the same time, corrosive to influence in international affairs. Hasten to recall that at the first Lambeth Conference in 1867, Archbishop William Thompson of York wouldn't even agree to attend because he felt it crossed his provincial boundaries and would lead to a centralization. The Sixth Lambeth Conference, 1920, Archbishop St. Clair Donaldson of Brisbane, soon to be translated back home to be Bishop of Salisbury, chaired the committee charged by Archbishop Davison with a report on Christianity and international relations, especially the League of Nations. And Archbishop Donaldson had to take pains to acknowledge the generosity with which the American bishops had taken part in the deliberations, notwithstanding the United States' rejection of the League of Nations. And even then, there was a footnote in the text recording that while the American bishops cordially agreed in principle to a League of Nations, they were, and I quote, obliged to withhold their support of the existing covenant without certain reservations. So suspicion of centralization. Secondly, relative modesty of scope. Only, in fact, at the Fourth Lambeth Conference, 1897, was the topic of international relations addressed in 3 very modest resolutions. Number 41, which emphasized the belief that arbitration could be claimed to not merely be a practice but a principle founded upon the teachings of Christ. Resolution 42, that peace was both a cause and a duty and something that involved the public conscience as well as appealing to enlightened public opinion. And finally, Resolution 43, that all Christians had a duty to work for peace and that this duty should be defined by prayer, private instruction, as well as public appeal. Fast forward another decade, a couple decades to Lambeth 7, 1930, and the debate over resolutions 25 and 27 on war as an instrument of policy. Seemingly uncontroversial enough, but there was that debate against the enthusiasm of Bishop John Kempthorne of Lichfield and, of course, George Bell of Chichester, the objections of Herbert Hensley Henson of Durham and Henry Hobson of Southern Ohio. Third point from history. Yet, despite all this, despite these struggles, a breadth of principle. And we see that in the Sixth Lambeth Conference, whose probably most memorable achievement was the appeal to all Christian people. And I quote, "We commend to all Christian people the principles which underlie the League of Nations, the most promising, most systematic attempt to advance towards the ideal of the family of nations which has ever been projected." A little bit enthusiastic, but still the breadth there. Fourth takeaway from this period is the growing awakening of an ecumenical thrust. We see this in the 1920s with the World Conference of Life and Work, the contributions made there by George Bell, then Dean of Canterbury, and subsequently, of course, Bishop of Chichester. The belief that war as an institution for the settlement of international disputes was, and I quote Bishop Bell, or Dean Bell at the time, incompatible with the mind and method of Christ. Of course, that continued as Archbishop Lang's efforts to build a common front with the Pope and other religious leaders in the lead up to World War II. And then after the war, 1958, the Ninth Lambeth Conference, the Statement on Peace, which addressed not only, and for the first time, our fellow Christians, but more broadly, all who will listen to us. And finally, fifth characteristic I would take away from this what I call the developing period, is the informed nature of the perspective. There's a whole study in its own right to be done about George Bell's involvement with the Grotius Society, which was founded in 1915 and after 1958 became known as the British Institute of International and Comparative Law. It's worthy of a whole study in itself, that rich collaboration between Dean and subsequently Bishop Bell and the international law movement in the UK. But at the same time, also on his other initiatives, on nuclear war and peace, his collaboration with the noted physicist, Professor J.E. Roberts. Again, very deep and worthy of a study in itself. And then, if you look at the report which the Archbishops of Canterbury and York prepared at 1948 at the request of the Church Assembly on the Church and the atom. There, again, the main work, the body of work was done by, of course, the Dean of Winchester, Edward Selwyn, and it was based on a rather interesting, archivally, wide consultative consultation of experts from across, really, the academia, government, and well beyond the frontiers of the church. So 5 characteristics of that period. Now, more recently, recent efforts since then, 1960 onward, I kind of teased out about 3 characteristics that, broadly speaking, we're painting here broadly. And by the way, in this next section, I don't mean to forget the exceptions on the parts of individuals or local churches. And Dr. pointed out earlier the great example of Archbishop Trevor Huddleston and his particular witness to the racism that was encroaching and increasingly dominant in the politics of South Africa, and the impact that he has had. In my own work on post-government service in peace building in Africa, I've partnered up on a number of occasions with former South African President Motlanthe. And what's interesting about us as a duo has been he is a self-described former Anglo-Catholic, his religion becoming the party subsequently, and he's spoke about that, but we've had an interesting dynamic that there's still that lingering influence, and we'll see. But some of the characteristics, I tease away 3 I would lay out there. One is the move away from principles, which characterized the first period, towards specificity. And that's on some hand, it lends a concreteness to it, but the other hand, and I would submit this, and I wrote in the paper, that movement, and perhaps a pivot might be seen, leads to some notable lapses. Good example, the 12th Lambeth Conference, 1988, which just before the Iron Curtain came crashing down, waxed eloquent on new opportunities for cooperation with the Soviet Union. Didn't last long. While getting into very detailed prescriptions about Israel and Lebanon, not Israel and Palestine, but Israel and Lebanon, Latin America, Namibia, and Sudan. Some of those permanent issues, others very ephemeral, even before the ink was dry. Second characteristic of this second period that I would tease out is the lack of structures for consulting expertise, much less cultivating it. Unlike the life and work movement, which began in the Church of Sweden under Archbishop Nathan Soderblom, and which eventually established actually a research department based in Geneva, which joined together eventually with the Faith and Order Conference, which was the great work of our own Bishop Charles Henry Brent, led eventually to the rise of the World Council of Churches, which had its own Commission of Churches and International Affairs. No such structure exists until fairly recently, and they're in minute and under-resourced within the Anglican Communion as a whole, or many of the provinces individually. Third point I would raise as characteristics of this period: a failure to address sometimes existential concerns of the provinces of the Global South. You can give an example from the most recent, just a few months ago, the 15th Lambeth Conference. The statement of support for Nigeria issued on the 8th of August, 2022, although granted the Church of Nigeria chose for other reasons to absent itself, so one has to add that caveat. But the statement that the bishops gathered were particularly grieved by the security, economic, religious, and political challenges faced by Nigeria and Nigerians. as the center of their concern. And I speak with great deference in the presence of my good friend, Ambassador John Campbell, the expert on Nigeria. It certainly led to criticism from both from advocacy groups, the likes of Christian Solidarity International, as well as Nigerian church leaders. And I quote Bishop Ben Kwashi of Jos, which really is the epicenter of some of the violence in Nigeria's Middle Belt. The communion cannot now and only now be claiming support verbally and without action. For how long has Nigeria been in the situation that has only now come to the fore? What practical support has the communion shown? Sad to say, in the same statement Nigeria is being subtly chastised, I'm not sure that those who have risked their lives to come and pray and cry with us over the years are recognized for their efforts. It's pretty damning. And then there's a personal example I would cite, which is the lack of attention, not just at the communion level, but on individual provinces that might have borne a little. In the case of the province of the Anglican Church of the Congo, which is a fascinating study, and the bishops of that province, all 12 of them, were at Lambeth this year, which is the issue of their legal status within their own country. For a variety of reasons linked to do with the Belgian colonial history, the legal regime inherited by the Democratic Republic of the Congo recognized only 3 religions: Roman Catholicism, Judaism, and every other Christian bundled up together in one legal structure. And one can imagine, you can imagine the nightmare that becomes when it comes to administering the temporal goods of the church, when you lump together everything from the Anglican Church all the way through to the prosperity gospel and make them all work through the same channels. It's a nightmare. Fortunately, a little bit of good news. Finally, after a bit of effort, just a week ago, the president of the Democratic Republic of the Congo finally signed the decree granting separate legal. So now there are 4 legal structures for religion: Roman Catholicism, the Jewish community, the Anglicans, and everyone else. But the absence of I think the broader communion in that certainly undermines its own international witness as well as its contribution to international affairs. Let me conclude with 2 modest recommendations broadly. The first is the communion as a whole, the provinces, need to privilege the voice and the concerns of the global church, especially those in the global south, where the demographic is, both in terms of their existential concerns in some cases, and in other cases, their voice. Steps have been taken in this direction, certainly admirable steps, but a long way needs to be done still. And thirdly, perhaps the most, is a return to basics. The period of the great flourishing of and growing witness was based on theological reflection. The emphasis, Secretary mentioned, on the increasing awareness in theology of the incarnation, those broad principles, as opposed to getting very down into the weeds, especially when the weeds aren't accompanied by expertise in the matter. As a political scientist as well as a theologian, I never cease this to amaze me how theologians would never think of talking about bioethics or the questions medicine without first talking to doctors and others involved in the healing arts. Or would not think about talking about climate change without consulting panels of experts. But when it comes to ordinary politics, everyone is an expert. Leads to some awkward situations, put mildly, at times, and deprives the voice not only of credibility, but of effect. Let me conclude by 2 great quotations from Archbishop Michael Ramsey that I think speak to this challenge of, and really address both the reason for the lack of influence in the voice today and the possibilities for tomorrow. I quote Archbishop Ramsey: "Because of the great cultural diversity in the Anglican Communion, its future unity, coherence, integrity, and vigorous mission to the world will not depend on cultural forces, but on its going to rely upon the heritage of spirituality, theological principle, and tradition. The Anglican Communion will fulfill this mission if it realizes that it has within itself spiritual treasures that are able to transcend cultural differences and may even be able to unite them. What is the relationship between Christianity and the world? It is possible for the Church to merge itself with the world's cultures, to be so identified with them as to lose the power of criticizing them and thus healing them. It is also possible for the Christian Church, on the contrary, to remain aloof from the world's diverse cultures in its own quest for spiritual purity and integrity, and to make no impact on them at all. Those are obviously both unsatisfactory stances. Is it not the true calling of the Church, therefore, to identify itself with all that is good in the world in such a way as to be able to influence it, but influence it because the Church represents a spirituality that transcends the barriers of time and place? Thank you.
There he is. All right, our third speaker in this first session. And John, you can hear me? Okay, good. Is Professor John Milbank. He's Emeritus Professor in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at the University of Nottingham in the UK, where he is also President of the Center of Theology and Philosophy. Professor Milbank is the author of numerous books, including Theology and Social Theory and Radical Orthodoxy. He has degrees from Oxford, Cambridge, and Birmingham. And he's going to speak to us via Zoom, on Anglicanism and monarchy.
Yes, well, thank you for inviting me. And as said, I was asked to talk about Anglicanism and monarchy, which I've written about recently for Unheard. But I feel a little embarrassed now because the two talks so far have been about Anglicanism and international affairs. And I'd like to make what I'm saying a little bit relevant to that, at least, and also to the theme of Anglicanism and incarnationalism in relation to social policy that's already been broached. So this is, of course, an apposite moment to talk about Anglicanism and monarchy, because we've got a new king and British politics is in absolutely unprecedented turmoil, which is by no means over, I think. And for example, it appears that the king was prevented from attending the climate conference by our last prime minister. You know, that was about a week ago. And now the new government is saying that he can attend after all, but it's not quite clear what the situation really is there. And of course, not long ago, perhaps the most watched event in the entire history of the world took place, the Queen's funeral. President Macron of Republican France said for us, she was the Queen, not just your Queen. So the question of the sort of strange international dimension of the British monarchy is something maybe we could think about. And of course, one aspect of that is simply this is the last king left standing. The others have all lost their head, or they're in a state of quiet retreat. So it's an object of fascination. But I think there's a little more to it than that, because I think the Queen, in the face of the teeth of the opposition of the Foreign Office, the sometimes very Atlanticist or else simply pro-Europe, really took a huge role in crafting the Commonwealth, in ensuring that, if you like, the empire survived in a mutated form as the Commonwealth. And there is research about that. The idea that she was simply a kind of symbolic figure who didn't do anything political is frankly completely untrue. And it's also very striking the way in which the Duke of Edinburgh and now his son, King Charles, have somehow always identified themselves with very global issues. I mean, specifically with ecological issues, where they seem to have been prophetically ahead of their times, but also with questions of religious dialogue. And the Duke of Edinburgh was enormously knowledgeable about religion, as anybody who's met, who knows about him will tell you. And his son has very much inherited that, and more so. And the question of sort of the relationship between religions, and very much sort of behind Charles's interest in perennialism, if you like, so that the interest in sort of being a unifying actor, it's almost as if there's a sense that the British monarchy can't just survive as a national monarchy, that it maybe because Britain has always tried to play something like a world role, but also somehow because it's the last standing really sacral monarchy, that somehow it has to have a kind of almost a civilizing role that goes beyond simply Britain. And I think this is a sort of fascinating question. Will if the British monarchy is going to survive, perhaps it will only survive because it has, in some sense, this global role. There's this kind of symbolic role as representing these kind of universal causes that people can identify with. And this may be a stretch, but it's almost in a very funny kind of way, as if Henry VIII wanted to be Holy Roman Emperor, and it's as if, in some sense, the British monarchy now plays almost something like that kind of role. And of course, perhaps most people, and perhaps particularly Catholics, will say, well, look, the papacy is a completely valid role, but the role of emperors and the roles of kings, that's just a sort of historic anomaly. And I think the more I've thought about this from a theological point of view, the more I don't think it's true. I think that the papal role emerged just as contingently and just as symbolically, if you like, as the role of kings. And should Anglicanism be ashamed of the fact that it has a king as the head of the church? Isn't that an anomaly, from a Protestant point of view of the authority of the Bible, or from a Catholic point of view of the spiritual authority of the priesthood, and so on? But I think it's less of an anomaly if we remember that historically in the Orthodox churches, kingship played a great role. And I think, ultimately this does have biblical and Christological foundations. I think there is a link between sacral kingship and constitutional rule, not really a kind of antagonism as you might expect, if you're thinking in terms of 17th century, divine right of kings, but that's an exception and an exaggeration. If we're thinking about the Bible, it's clear that Saul is anointed, so he's got a sort of quasi-priestly or prophetic task, but just by virtue of his being anointed, he is subordinate to the temple, subordinate to the law, and even subordinate to the will of the people. There's a kind of idea of constitutional monarchy in the Bible itself, as people later like Aquinas recognized. And clearly, I don't think there's there's any mileage in the idea that a Christian state ought to be a monarchy. No, a republic is a perfectly valid form of government. Although one can note that in some ways America rebelled against Parliament more than against monarchy, and ensured that it did have its own equivalent of monarchy in the form of a presidency. So that there's a sense in which both Britain and America are committed to mixed governments, and that a monarchic role in some sense is part of that. But I don't, on the other hand, think it's true, as some people say, that the Old Testament is only reluctantly monarchical. In fact, in Deuteronomy, I think chapter 17, the Israelites wandering the wilderness are promised that they will have a king one day. So the way all this pans out in the book of Samuel, I think, has to be read rather carefully, that Samuel himself belonged to the oligarchic judge class. And even so, it's made clear there was a lot of corruption amongst the judges. And I think it's much more that something like I'm wanting to call constitutional monarchy is seen as really, quite an ideal solution. And certainly, I think in the Middle Ages, people felt that there was a harmony between what the Bible was saying and what the Greeks had said about the ideality of mixed constitution and monarchy forming part of that. But in a way, still most strikingly, we really underrate the links of kingship with Christology. And of course, Shakespeare doesn't do that at all. And Shakespeare is remarkably important here. But, in the New Testament, it's clear in Luke and Matthew's lineages of Joseph, Jesus's adopted father, that on the one hand, for Luke, he stresses descent from David down a priestly line, but Matthew down a kingly line. So the idea that in some sense, Jesus is both king and priest, and that he's a priest after the order of Melchizedek, who combined both roles, is extremely important. And we, of course, think in ideas of, in terms of separating church and state, or else of, the subordination of the state to the church, if we're crazy integralists, a lot of them about nowadays, apparently. But really, if you look at the early medieval legacy, it's just not that simple, because there was a concern to divide the kingly and the priestly roles in order, not to sort of rival Christ, in whom they are combined. And yet this implies that, the kingly role is also a sacral role. Oh, okay, the king is anointed by the priests. Okay, to begin with, in Augustine and Gelasius, the secular city of this world is not exactly within the church, although it comes to be in the later Middle Ages, but it's sort of half in, and it's half in the church kind of via the role of the sacral anointed king, so that, even Augustine talks a lot about, the mirror for princes, and the importance of a God-fearing monarch. So there isn't exactly sort of our idea of the duality of church and state. Moreover, while it's clear that there's a subordination of the kingly to the priestly function, and a subordination of the emperor to the pope, things are not quite as simple as that if you're thinking in terms of the subordination of this world to the spiritual. That's true, but there's also a very powerful sense present in Byzantium that the emperor is the more eschatological figure. In other words, at the end of time, God is king. He's in some sense, Christ is an eternal priest, but because the priestly role is a mediating role, it's much more the kingly role that survives eschatologically. And then joined to that is the link of kingship with resurrection and the body. So at the end of time, there's going to be an abolition of the sacred spiritual divide, and also the body will be divinized. So there's as many of you will know, there's a minority report in the Middle Ages discussed by people like Ernst Kantorowicz, saying, in fact, the kingly role is superior to the priestly role. And in part for these kind of eschatological reasons that I'm talking about. And we find that tradition not just in the East, but also in England, in the famous document known as written by the so-called Norman Anonymous, or the Anonymous of York. So the sense of sacral kingship has always been, even prior to the Reformation, very, very, very strong in England. And linked to that, as Kantorowicz also said, the doctrine of the king's two bodies, which is somehow an echo of Christology, the idea that the body, the actual human literal body dies, but there's a kind of ethereal body that goes on. And I think that it's extraordinary the degree to which the people in the famous queue at the Queen's funeral experienced something really strangely religious, and very much to their shock and surprise. It was as if they were experiencing incarnation and even kind of kenosis, that monarchy is somehow serving the people, self-emptying reality. And I deride the derision one gets for saying that sort of thing. I think it's a failure to think things through more profoundly. But I think people also have the sense that the Queen dies, and immediately, without any enactment, Charles is then king. So that the body of the monarch is immortal. There's a kind of frisson in that moment. And is all this simply symbolic and politically meaningless? I don't think so, because I think symbolism is incredibly important. And this sense that there is something transcendent, something bringing us together, that somehow the sacral is here incarnate, it survives, it's somehow resurrected even on earth. I think people got a glimpse of that. And it was in the most stark, incredible contrast to the hyper-individualist vision of Liz Truss, which of course didn't survive very long. But I think it's by reason of that contrast that the king didn't bother to disguise his absolute contempt for Liz Truss. And of course, the question of how far he's going to sustain some sort of political action or some sort of political role, remembering, that the higher politics is about the common good and the continuity of past to the future rather than party politics. And the higher politics is also about a British civilizational witness, an international witness that I think the monarchy is very, very attached to. It's important to remember those things. So I think if we're thinking in more specifically Anglican terms, then what is very striking, particularly if you look at Richard Hooker, is again the link of kingship and constitution to Christology. That Hooker, as Rowan Williams has stressed, Hooker's Christology puts a great stress on the unity of the two natures. And he also stresses the so-called exchange of idioms between the divine and human nature of Christ. And there's a sense in which he very much thinks of the English constitution along these lines, that the church aspect and the political aspect are indeed separate, and yet they're not totally separate. And in an emergency, they can correct each other. And in a further emergency, the monarch can correct both of them. So I think this helps to drive this sort of powerfully incarnational sense in the Anglican legacy, which is very much in its own way in continuity with the patristic legacy, even with a Thomist legacy, that it very much refuses the kind of pure nature and the separation of nature and grace that has tended to be prevalent in sort of post-Tridentine Roman Catholicism, and only really rejected in the course of the 20th century. Just as I think Anglicanism has always sustained this sense that the church is a cosmic reality, that being the church is what it is to be a Christian, that Anglicans often sustain that at points where that had been forgotten in the Catholic inheritance. And again, it's only people like de Lubac and Congar that really recovered that sense in the 20th century, it causing them, in a sense, to veer more towards an Anglican point of view. And I think there are the two other things one can emphasize in Hooker as well. I think the fact that he places a great stress upon the natural side of things, and yet he doesn't sort of separate this too sharply from the sacral side, means that he understands very well that the divine is mediated by human activity, almost a sort of Renaissance sense of the creativity of human activity, and that is always kind of mediating this participation. So there isn't an antithesis in Hooker somehow between the sense that the polity is formed by human beings, and yet it is a sacral polity, that for him, literally, the English state is also a church, because it's very much the sense that this is a transcendent reality that can't be readily formulated. It's sort of mystically present, so that part of this in Hooker is his great disdain for sort of Puritan half-educatedness. He hates the mode of Puritan, very abstract, poetic language. And on the other hand, he also and equally celebrates a folk wisdom, a kind of borrowed vox populi in the people. And he sees the role of the king in a way as very much bringing those two things together and holding them in balance and harmony. It's also the case that Hooker insists that the king is present just as much in convocation as he is present in Parliament. So in the body the governing body of the church as much as in that of Parliament. So that there's, for him, if there's a sort of divine kingly factor in worldly affairs, there's also a constitutional factor to balance that in church affairs. And in both cases, the king's role is constitutional. He has to respect tradition. He has to respect law, both civil and canon law. He's not an absolute monarch. And finally, the fact that he's anointing means that even though he is head of the church, he is also, his role is in the gift of the church. Ultimately, the whole church, if you like, is what is authorizing the role of the king. And there's a sense in which Hooker knows that England is in this situation because of circumstance. And that's part of his kind of pragmatism, but recognition that a pragmatic situation may nonetheless be conveying something of the truth. And so I think, what I would finally want to suggest is that the situation of none of our churches is perfect. It's true that the Anglican Church is too much of a national church, even if it extends into the Commonwealth and beyond. And I think for that reason, Hooker's friend Richard Field was quite right to suggest that to get out of that, Anglicans need to look eventually towards a constitutional model of the whole church. In other words, they should be conciliarists. They should be looking in the end for a model, the restoration of a model of the Pope in council. And I think that is true today. But I think the more sort of fascinating and yet trickier question is whether sort of by losing the role of sacral kingship, Christianity hasn't lost something of its integrity, so that, the more, European countries stopped being Catholic, the more the Pope became an ultramontane authority, but the more the Pope became rather absolutist, the Catholic Church became over-centralized, and to some extent this encouraged rather political papacy, that it, and I think only maybe John Paul II had something of a sense, because he was Polish, that you needed to restore some of the sort of more local incarnation. And I think Francis, because he's South American, has that sense in a different way with his advocacy of synodality. But that does sort of raise the very tricky question of, the complete secularization of the state and, the problems that France is running into with laicite compared to perhaps the relatively more integrated character of Britain in relation to different races and different religions, that Anglicanism seems to, in some way, massage that or serve that. And the question then of, whether in some sense a valid polity needs to, recognize something higher, something beyond itself, to sustain the sense of the common good. And it's very, very striking that the saner and more balanced countries in the world often are monarchies. And within Islam, for example, it seems to be the monarchies that operate more successfully and manage to be Islamic while avoiding extremism. So, nobody can say that the role of actual literal kings is completely crucial to Christianity. And yet, perhaps there's more Christian and theological significance in this role than we've really imagined. And perhaps, either the British monarchy will collapse, after it's become too unpopular, or it's turned into Harry and Meghan show business or something like that. Or I think if it does survive, it will continue to have this sort of elevated, symbolic, and international role. It will be somehow about, what brings us together. Questions about ecology and the common good, and qualifying, the sheer pursuit of greed as the only end of human existence. It's quite clear that Charles is committed to the idea that human life is about flourishing and harmony beyond that sort of thing. And of course, he's only one individual. And yet it seems as if it's partly because he's reflected on what monarchy can now mean. He's not a genius. He's a clever man, but not a genius. It's partly because he's reflected on that I think he has come to those conclusions. So those are really just some things for you to ponder, and particularly the question of Anglicanism and monarchy in relation to the international role, and the question of how far Anglican incarnationalism is connected to the link between kingship and Christology. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to open up a discussion amongst three speakers. All right, so I'm going to hand this over to Peter if you have any insights you want to bring.
That's a huge amount to ponder there from your last talk, John. I suppose I was thinking about the interesting way in which the House of Windsor in particular has really advanced interfaith relationships. Thinking, I suppose, of the Commonwealth service in Westminster Abbey, which was basically this quite a bit of argy-bargy there with Church of England canon law, but they could have a lot of interfaith service in the Abbey in the way in which they couldn't have in Anglican parish churches. And the degree to which, if King Charles sees himself as shaping a kind of a culture in which lively faith traditions can coexist, whether that presents some kind of challenge to the integrity of the Church of England in its public life and its proclamation of the gospel. Whether that makes sense.
Well, I don't think it does. I mean, I think I don't know in detail, but I think Charles has tended to get more influenced by Eastern Orthodoxy over the last 20 years and possibly has gravitated more to a Christian perspective. But I don't think it's inappropriate at all for Anglicanism to be especially concerned with ecumenism and integration. I think I would almost say that, within Christianity, because it has some Protestant legacy, a lot of Latin legacy, but also some things that connect it to Orthodoxy, including kingship in part, as I'm suggesting. I think that for that reason, Anglicanism ought to see itself as having an ecumenical destiny within Christianity. And I think it's really kind of lost sight of that. And, to be quite candid, this is partly because the way it's so dominated now by one sort of liberal evangelical or charismatic strand, rather than trying to represent, the whole of the church, that I think this kind of international mission has rather declined, and that seems rather tragic at a point where in world history we once again got a clash of Eastern Orthodox legacy countries, or a split within them, of course, and actually the Pope's response to this has not been terribly good in lots of ways. and you would think that this is a chance, a moment where Anglicanism could genuinely say something creative. I think Richard Field was right all along that, we're with the Greeks about conciliarism, but we we can accept the primacy of Peter. There's not really a problem. It's the sort of papal absolutism that is the problem. And I think that it's not valid for the Anglicanism to see itself as only a national church, because no church should see it that way. And I think it's remarkable how far Anglicanism on the whole has avoided a narrow nationalism. And that's partly, as has already been suggested, this is kind of the good aspect of empire. And I was always struck when I worked in America that actually American Episcopalian churches pray far less for the world than Anglican churches tend to in England. There's much more systematic praying for the whole world, I think, in England. So in any case, a national church must avoid just being a national church. And I think the way it does that is to have that onlook towards, ecumenical unity. And, like Vladimir Solovyev, the great, Russian Orthodox philosopher, I feel it's possible to say as a Christian, no church, no denomination is perfect. There are faults in all of them. And part of the enterprise of reintegration is to arrive at something better. But I think, and again, this is a Solovyev kind of thing, that it doesn't stop simply at the Christian religion, but, the recognition of what we have in common with other religions, and the sense that the aspects of other religions are proximate to the Christian religion. And even if we think the Trinitarian and the Christological vision somehow takes you to a new level, then it is precisely, that vision rather than something narrow. And that vision, as Nicholas of Cusa, another great ecumenist, saw, it's that vision that can somehow relate to other religions as well. So I'm sort of with Charles, I think, in what I understand about of his relationship to other faiths.
Thank you. Just a comment on John's reflections, and then I'd like to pose a question to Daniel. John, thank you very much for those rich musings and points of reflection. And what I'm thinking of, and turning around in my head, is the interesting interplay that one potentially has. When we saw that coming out of the death of the Queen, and the outpouring, not just, as you mentioned, from Great Britain, the Commonwealth, but especially from the countries of the Christian East. That linkage of, especially the late Duke of Edinburgh's family, his mother, the Princess Andrew of Greece, and her aunt, the Grand Duchess Elisabetta, and that linkage with the recent canonization in the Orthodox Church of Cyril Lucaris, who had a long history of relationship with the Church of England, dating back to 4 centuries now. There's an interesting interplay there to be seen. It'll be interesting how that plays out. I'd like to pose a question in a way, and like a response from McDermott about, I was very struck by your caution about moral judgments in historical contexts. I've always been troubled with this phenomena, and I would say, I would even call it a fad, and I would place the blame for popularizing fad. I wouldn't place the origin, but for popularizing it among world religious leaders with the late Pope John Paul II, this apologies issued and repentance on behalf of long dead people who have gone on to judgment already. And part of that, what has always troubled me about that is not that these gestures are popular or unpopular, that to me is relatively irrelevant, but rather the lack of theology behind them. Personal repentance, we have a whole rich theology on it, but repentance on behalf, it always struck me as something like not dissimilar to Mormonism's baptism of the dead. Quite frankly, then theologically it sort of worked on the same level, and that ties into what my comment about the lack of theology and sort of, I wonder if you leave it to open that as a question and invitation to comment further.
Thank you. Yes, I don't think I was. I wouldn't want to say that. I think all historians come with a moral framework, and actually, it's far better when we're honest about those philosophical or theological frameworks. I suppose when you're approaching them, I think in the nature of academic history, where we like to think it's entirely secular discipline, that's unrealistic to some degree, that we all come with our preconceptions about what is good and what is evil, and that is played out in the way in which we interpret and handle particular evidence all the time. And I suppose the role of history within the church currently is one which is either we don't deal with history very well, or we kind of sideline it and just stick to the moral judgments, or the danger is we just remain in the historical mode and don't, I suppose, step into the theological. Actually, in cathedrals, at the moment, one of my roles is interpretation in relation to the cathedral's history, and of course that's had a sort of been a sort of enthusiasm for iconoclasm, I suppose, in English churches at the moment, in terms of tearing down monuments, or desire among some to tear down monuments which are deemed to make others feel uncomfortable coming into particular buildings. And so this big test case at Jesus College, Cambridge, in relation to the Rustat Memorial and slavery is a case in point. My own sense really is that is yours really, that unless you can enter a church building and recognise yourself as a sinner and sinners on the wall, then what confidence do we have in walking into that building in the first place anyway, unless we have a concept of forgiveness and reconciliation. And that's where the interesting role of a nuanced historical engagement can really contribute towards a healthier church, where that reconciliation is meaningful rather than just these rather grand statements of repentance on behalf of those dead a long time ago. Sounds a bit rambling, but it's heading in your direction, probably. Yeah. I don't know whether John might have other feelings about monuments, which is a live question in relation to the church.
I'm totally against taking any statues. I'm completely against taking any statues down, I'm afraid. I think I've no idea why this fad has arisen. I don't think that the reasons given for why we're concerned with this are remotely plausible. I think there's something else going on, and I think it's a huge distraction from, the real issues of injustice and inequality in our world today, including racism and slavery today. It strikes me as a very modish distraction, so that there may be some extreme exceptions, but most of the statues being removed, it's completely ambivalent. These are people we can't make moral judgments on because they didn't live in our moral universe. And in any case, they were a mixture of good and bad, often, as has been just illustrated so well in the first lecture. And I don't think the church should succumb to these pressures at all. I think the church needs to think it through for itself theologically, and where would you stop? it feels to me like a kind of iconoclasm. And in the end, it seems to me it is a kind of reverse racism, a hatred of the West, a hatred of ourselves. I don't know any other way to interpret it, actually. And I think if we go along with it, we're going down a really dangerous road. Where we'll be asked to remove everything that matters to us from the historical past. And the problem at the moment is the complete opposite, that we're not passing it on enough in our schools to most young people. The real issue for me is that only a few rich people in public schools are learning anything about their legacy. Most people are deprived of this legacy in most of the schools they go to. I mean, those are the issues the church should be talking about.
I'll just ask you a question, Peter. Sorry, about when you're talking about what the role the church could play in international diplomacy, I was thinking a bit about Soderbergh and what was achieved in Geneva in terms of research institute. I mean, do you feel something similar could be established today?
My response would be, I think something similar is needed, but in the politicized nature of our polity as a communion, I'm not sure how one practically goes about it. One of the tragedies in recent years, and I devote my career to, my secular career primarily to Africa, has been the absence, self-exile of provinces like Nigeria, Kenya, Rwanda, and others from our common councils. And so how does one go about that? Practically, I don't have the answer, but theoretically, I think we need something of that nature, and to reflect and not to create more bureaucracies. That's the last thing we need, but to have a place to not only consult but also cultivate it. And there's some fascinating examples. I mean, if you look at the archives of what Dean Selwyn did in the consultations for the archbishops of Canterbury and York to come up with the 1948 document on what they were still using the term atomic warfare, the vast consultations there, the rich dialogues that Bishop Bell had. One doesn't have to clericize it further. I think that's a danger. We are in theory the people that live via media, and so we shouldn't clericize it. But there's a way of consulting that I think mechanisms need to be solved somehow. I don't have the answer.
All right. We're going to open up. Thank you for all of this. We're going to open up to the floor, however. We have a hard stop at 3 o'clock. So in order to ask a question of one of the speakers, we'll need you to go to this microphone here. And so you have to be bold and get up and, speak in public. Does anyone have a burning question?
Thank you so much for all of your excellent presentations. My question is for Dr. Milbank. In your talk, you briefly mentioned integralism and contrasted your vision with that. And I know that Kevin Valier, who's a philosopher at Bowling Green State, has a book coming out on integralism where he's also contrasted this. I was wondering if you could expand on that, contrasting between the integralist vision, which seems to be becoming more and more sort of figured out as they go along, and your vision of just sort of contrast this more sort of moderate position. Thank you.
Yes, well, that's very interesting. Well, I've just written a long article about the integralist debate, in part in New Polity, which is just out. So you can see my answer to your question in more detail there. But I suppose, you could say that although I'm opposing the prevailing integralism, my own vision is integralist in a slightly different way. It's the way that's described by, again, Soloviev. I've been reading him, sorry to keep mentioning him. He described it as free theocracy. So by free theocracy, what he meant was that the church can't be constraining the state by a set of clerical powers or something like that. But nonetheless, a valid state for him should be looking towards the church for its ultimate guidance. So he's saying, in a way, yes, a true polity ought to be a theocracy, but it should be a free theocracy. And you could very well say that this is what Hooker thinks as well, although perhaps, obviously Hooker had rather too strong a sense that, to be a citizen meant to be an Anglican, which we can't possibly have now, nor should we want to have that. Another way of putting this is to say that we need to distinguish between authority and power. That, the church has ultimate authority, but it doesn't have ultimate power. And I think if you forget that distinction, and I do think the new wave of integralists forget that distinction, then you start talking about a sort of power of the clergy over the laity, or a power of the church over the state. And then the final important remark to make here is that the new integralists, all the young men in suits and ties who live in college towns and have about 20 children, and so yeah, but typically they embrace also neo-scholasticism and a very sharp division between nature and grace. So ironically, their integralism doesn't integrate nature and grace. They think that natural and political ends are completely independent, something that Aquinas certainly doesn't think, because although he thinks there was politics in Eden before the fall, he thinks that was a politics under grace. His thought is just as much Byzantine as it is Aristotelian, if you like to put it that way. The Latins were Stoics who thought that before the fall was an anarchy. Aquinas is returning to a much more Greek view that before the fall there was kingship echoing a cosmic kingship. And again, this is a view that very much integrates nature and grace. And I was stressing that Hooker does that. And so if you separate nature and grace, then your view is that because grace is superior to nature, the church can somehow coerce the state. And this is very, very wrong. And it's also actually compatible with the idea that, your conception of the natural state might be incredibly secular. And this is exactly why in the past there was, a devil's alliance between atheist positivists like Charles Maurras and Catholic integralists in Action Française and so on. And, the danger of a replay of that kind of thing is seriously, I think, very, very real. Whereas I think that if you have a more integrated view of nature and grace, then what you're saying is that politics looks beyond politics. It's not that politics is answerable to, the Pope or bishops telling you what to do. It's that politics looks beyond itself. And I think that's symbolized by the way in which, the British monarchy doesn't have ordinary political powers, but somehow is a point where politics is looking to something higher than that. And it's keeping a check on ordinary politics in the name of the spiritual. It's a real point of conjuncture between the two. So I would argue that the British monarchy, Occupy, does operate according to the principles of free theocracy. And I think it's integralist in a good sense and not in the bad sense. Not that I'm saying integralism has to be Anglican. I hasten to say, I'm not saying that.
I too would like to thank all three of the speakers for their thoughtful comments, and I also have a question for Professor Milbank. This is a two-stage question. First, I'm wondering if you find yourself in conversation here with John Neville Figgis as he thinks about the relationship between
absolutely. I was, right way back in the 70s, the young Rowan Williams, drummed into me that I had to read John Neville Figgis. And so, of course, I read John Neville Figgis. And, Figgis's pluralism, his suspicion of absolute central sovereignty and so on, is very important to me. And I was eventually a Christendom Fellow at Lancaster, which meant I was influenced also by Vigo de Mant, canon at Christ Church, who was in the same pluralist tradition. So I'm more in that tradition than I am in the William Temple, more statist tradition. Although, to be fair to Temple, he could sometimes be influenced by the other tradition as well, So I think, Figgis teaches us to be suspicious of the idolatry of absolute sovereignty. That's a reason, one reason I was not a Brexiteer as well, because I think internal pluralism goes along with a willingness to share sovereignty across borders as well.
Yes. Did you have a question, Patrick? Yeah.
Hi, the name is Patrick Montezera, and I'd like to actually preface my question by quotes of Jesus from John, the Gospel of John, chapter 17, where he said, "My prayer is not for them alone, I pray also for those who will believe in me through their message, that all of them may be one. Father, just as you are in me and I am in you, may they also be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. I have given them the glory that you gave me, that they may be one, as we are one. I in them, and you in me, so that they may be brought to complete unity. Then the world will know that you sent me and have loved them, even as you have loved me." How far, and from all of this question is for everyone actually, how far are we from this stage?
Who wants to take that question?
I'm just 2,000 years old. So we are nowhere.
Well, I suppose I'd say we're probably some way within the Anglican community for that, I suppose. But I suppose to what John was saying really about perhaps the unique gift of Anglicanism and the conflicts which have shaped it from its inception, really, that it has a particular calling perhaps to the ecumenical and to seeking understanding in conflict. And like John, I think the incarnation means that, and the Johannine mission can take that a long way beyond the purely denominational, and can have a rich vision, as I think it did across the empire, with many missionaries in the early 20th century and late 19th century, as I said.
I would only add to that perhaps there's a reason why John 13 came before John 17, and I don't mean that as a trite response to your question, which is a good one that we all should reflect upon. But in John 13, I call you friends, And it's that nature that friendship as the basis for witness and for unity. And I think that's something to be regretted in the loss of recent years of our inability, whether it be at the parochial level, diocesan level, provincial level, or on the community, to maintain that tension, that incarnational tension between us. And that's, I think, a tragedy. It's not irrecoverable, but I do think we need to work more intentionally in that regard.
Yes, I agree with what the other two speakers have said, and I would just add that I think we've deserted the Johannine vision, because today it's always a matter of individual self-assertion or individual rights, or else it's a matter of kind of formal rules, which we tend to need to deal with the subsequent anarchy, the anarchy that arises from that kind of individualism. And surely this isn't the vision at all of the New Testament. As has just been said, the vision of the New Testament is one of friendship or of interpersonal relations. It's not individualist. It's not a matter of formal frameworks or rights. It's always about the interpersonal and, you know, ricocheting expansions of the interpersonal. You know, the idea that a society is a society of friends, ultimately. And I think at every level in our society, everything has got horribly depersonalized. You know, you do one thing wrong and there's zero tolerance and you're excluded forever. You know, how Christian is that? It's not Christian at all. That, you know, we can never cancel anybody or exclude anybody. It's always a matter of trying to pull people back in. And I think, at least in England, the shocking thing is that the Church of England tends to deal with its own affairs too much in terms of, you know, rights and diversity and very, very formal procedures and tests of whether people are following formal procedures. So we're not being guided by the gospel when we do that.
James, did you have a question?
Yes, I do question.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is James Diddams. As Anglicans are wont to do, there's been a lot of talk about the relationship between sacred and secular authorities. I have a question along that line, but more specifically about the relation between, I suppose, sacred to secular to economic authorities. My question, I guess, I begin with addressing Dr. Milbank, something that you wrote on Twitter about. You said that it was a response to you, that I characterized your sense of economics as involving a strong welfare state, and you responded to me saying that that wasn't quite right, rather that you believe in a mutualist rather than welfarist socialism corporatism. That latter string of words, I presume, being like kind of normal secular social democracy, what I'm more used to thinking about. But this got me thinking, I'd love to, on one hand, know, I've never heard anyone describe a mutualist economic system. I honestly don't know what that is. I'd love to hear that. But beyond that, I'd love to know, are there any particular Anglican resources on a particularly Protestant Anglican sense of political economy as distinct from secular classical liberal on one hand and secular, socialist or whatever variety on the other hand? Is there some other way to think about this that I just haven't been exposed to?
Yeah, that's just a huge question, and I'm not sure there's much time to do justice to it. It's very, very important. I think if you look on the continent, there are a lot of people trying to shape an economy of gift exchanging or an economy rooted in gift exchanging. People like Alain Caillet in France or Luigino Bruni in Italy. And Bruni was one author of Caritas in Veritate, of Benedict's economic encyclical. And I suppose this is partly to do with crafting a different kind of market, a market in which businesses would have to have social purposes in which negotiations over prices, investments, wages would have a kind of ethical dimension built into them. So in the traditions of Italian civil economy, it's less amoral. It's more understood there are social considerations within economic transactions. So Bruni is famous for having pointed out that the great 18th century economist Antonio Genovese in Naples denies this Adam Smith point that you and the butcher don't care about each other's welfare. For the Italian tradition, you do, because you're neighbors, and because there's both a pragmatic and a benevolent interest in mutual welfare. So we've got, in the Anglo-Saxon tradition, we have incredibly sharp divisions between the social, the political, and the economic. To some extent, continental traditions, especially in Italy and Germany, don't have quite those divisions. And that's partly what I mean by having a more corporatist politics, where you're not separating the economic and the political. Michael Lind in the United States is the guy who has perhaps most thought this through. And he's famous for arguing that the post-war settlements were much more corporatist negotiations between unions, business, government, churches, and other civil bodies than they were simply social democratic, welfarist kind of settlements, you know. And the trouble with welfarism is it's too much simply like, you know, a bandage on a wound. You know, we need to get distribution, what, you know, Ed Miliband, the Labour politician, describes as pre-distribution. We need to get distribution better in the first place. Welfare concern for other needs to be built into everything from the start. And then, of course, one payoff is you don't necessarily need such a huge state welfare benefits at the end of that process. But this is a big topic.
Brad, how big is your question?
I think it can be answered fairly briefly. I mean, it could be answered great length or fairly briefly.
Okay, so whoever answers Brad's question, you have 2 minutes.
All right, yeah. So this is also for Dr. Milbank. I was particularly intrigued by your remark that Queen Elizabeth and the British monarchy has kind of come to fill this sort of role of the Holy Roman Emperor as a kind of symbolic universal monarchy. And this is, in fact, goes way back in the Christian tradition. I mean, when Galatius says two there are by whom this world is governed, it doesn't just mean two powers, it kind of means two individuals. It's the idea that the Holy Roman Emperor, or the Roman Emperor, is the emperor of all the world in a symbolic sense. And that I've studied this in the early modern period, how that transitions from the Holy Roman Emperor to the King of France for a period. Is it your view that there's something in the Christian political imagination informed by Christ's universal kingship over the world that sort of instinctively looks for some kind of sacramental sign of Christ's universal kingship in some human figurehead, and so that it's almost inevitable that there will be an idea of a universal monarch?
I think the answer to that is roughly yes, but I'm hogging the stage. Do the others want to come in?
The other ones are saying no, and we're at time. It's well. Join me in thanking.